You know, one thing that I always found fascinating as a child is that the bubbles that these little dragons breathe out are virtually the same size they are, and yet are strong enough that they can jump on them. I mean, seriously, could you imagine what it'd be like if we had people-sized bubbles like these in real life? What the? Oh, jeez, the thing is freaking huge! Okay then. I guess that answers my question. Though now I got a much stupider question. How am I supposed to get out of my basement? That's the only way out. Maybe if... Ah, screw it. I'll deal with this after the review. Well guys, we're up to episode 100, and today's Ancient DOS game is special because it's been my all-time most favorite video game for over 2 decades, and that game is Bobble. Well, it might seem a bit odd that this game means so much to me, and consider this. This is one of the first few games I owned for the PC, and heck, I still even have my original discs for it. And save for some bad sectors that prevent the CGA mode from working properly, they still play fine. But the thing is, when I first played this game and started seeing all the different power-ups it had on display, it made me ever so curious what would happen every time I saw one that I didn't recognize. In fact, I still remember playing this game for months and then finding my very first brown candy power-up. I wasn't able to pick it up though and wondered for weeks what it could possibly do. Then played the NES version at a friend's house and figured it out, since the DOS version is the only one where the brown ones are so hard to come across. In fact, this leads into a bit of an interesting conundrum. All things considered, this is not a very good port of the original arcade game. It's still a good game, it's just not a good port, if that makes any sense. It's kind of like what happened with Castlevania Dracula X Rondo of Blood. The original PC Engine version of that game was such a masterpiece that when it was ported to the SNES, many considered the port to be terrible. Yet it was still a good game in its own right, it just didn't compare to the original. The DOS version of Bobble is just like that. There's many aspects of this port that just don't function anything like the arcade machine, but it's still a good game despite all that. Anyways, let's get into the game stats. Bobble was originally conceived by Taito, and while they did publish the DOS version of this game, the actual porting of the game was handled by John Petrovich over at Novalogic. As for when this port was released though, I don't have a freaking clue. The disc labels say 1988, the box says 1989, the file dates on the discs themselves say 1990, so yeah, just pick one and roll with it. The game itself is a 1 to 2 player arcade platformer with support for CGA 4 color, Tandy 16 color, EGA 16 color, and VGA 16 color graphics, all running at 320 by 200 resolution. The VGA mode looks the best by far thanks to its palette modifying capabilities. As for audio, it supports the PC speaker, the Tandy 3 voice chipset, the CMS Creative Music System, aka Game Blaster, and the AdLib card, which has the best sound support by far. The other modes all tend to sound way too high-pitched for their own good. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, and finding a copy of the DOS version is next to impossible. Besides, there are so many different ports of this game and so many modern remakes that you're probably better off just buying one of those, especially since most of them will play more like the original arcade version, save for some of the other early ports like the NES and the Commodore 64 versions. Though I'd avoid any of the portable iterations, as all of them have issues or quirks that most players probably aren't going to like. Even then though, I find many of the remakes just really don't have the same charm or feel of the original arcade game. So if you can find an arcade-perfect port like the one that comes with the Taito Legends compilation, that's probably your best bet for playing this game the way it was meant to be played. Though if you just want a cheap downloadable version, you can grab Bubble Bobble Plus for the Wii or Bubble Bobble Neo for the Xbox 360, both of which are essentially the same game but with an updated presentation, slightly altered physics, and a bunch of extra gameplay options and levels. Now, believe it or not, it's really hard to find accurate, detailed information about the story of this game, simply because it's different for virtually every port in existence. Though most versions have the two main characters, Bub and Bob, trying to rescue their girlfriends from the Cave of Monsters and find the magic to turn them back into human form. The DOS version in particular has you venturing through the Cave of Monsters to find a couple friends instead, though this kinda doesn't tie in with the ending. More on that later. Once you start the game up, you'll be dropped into the first of 100 levels you have to face in order to win, and the controls couldn't be simpler. You can move left and right, shoot bubbles, and jump. This DOS version actually lets you configure diagonal jumping buttons as well, but using these is totally unnecessary, and the game plays perfectly fine just using the jump button in combination with left or right movement. Basically though, what you're trying to do is hit the enemies with bubbles to capture them, then pop the bubbles in order to actually defeat those enemies. If you leave a bubbled enemy alone for too long though, they'll break free, get all angry and agitated, and start moving around much faster until you die. If only one enemy is left alive, it'll perpetually be angry until the level ends. Now, seeing as this was originally an arcade game, and some levels could go on forever given half the chance, there's a timer running in the background that starts counting down every time a new level begins or one of the players dies. Once this counter is low enough, the message "Hurry Up" appears on screen, and the music will start playing back faster. Once the counter expires, a special enemy known as Baron von Blubba will appear and start chasing you around until you either die or win the level. In a two-player game, two of these things appear, one chasing one player and one chasing the other. But yeah, while the bubble blowing mechanic was pretty unique at the time, the big draw for this game, besides having 100 levels, was the power-ups. There are so many power-ups in this game, I don't think I can adequately describe them all, but I will talk about some of the more common ones you'll come across. First though, there's something I need to address about how the power-ups appear. In the original arcade version, every level's power-ups work the same way. The first one to show up would simply be a scoring item, and the second one to show up would actually have an effect. In the DOS version, every single item that shows up can be either a scoring item or an effect item, so it's quite common to see two effect items in a single level, and sometimes neither will have any effects. This can lead to some interesting contradictions. For instance, if you pick up a candy cane or treasure chest, you normally get a huge, oversized scoring item at the end of the level, dropping down from the top of the screen. If you pick up one of these power-ups first though, then pick up something that instantly ends the level like a water cross or a bomb, it won't trigger the scoring item to fall down. Not to mention in a two-player game, it's potentially possible for two contradicting power-ups to be collected at the same time, though this is extremely rare and almost impossible to pull off intentionally, so I have no idea what actually happens if you do this. But yeah, as far as the power-ups are concerned, the two you're going to be seeing the most often are the blue candies and the purple candies. The blue ones cause your bubbles to travel much faster, while the purple ones greatly extend how far they'll reach. There's also brown candies that allow you to blow bubbles extremely rapidly, and while this power-up is normally just as common as the others in virtually every other port and even the arcade version, it's very hard to come across in the DOS version, so don't expect to see one of these until much later in. There's also a variety of trophy power-ups, one of which will give you all three of these bubble-enhancing powers. It's hard to say exactly which trophy though, because the trophy power-ups are even more rare and have been changed a bit from the original arcade version. The shoes are a very helpful power-up as they let you move a lot faster than normal, though for some odd reason I was having trouble finding these during my playthrough. In fact, one power-up that didn't seem to be working normally at all were the rings. You see, when you pick up a ring, you temporarily will gain points for one of three different actions: jumping, blowing bubbles, or just plain walking. However, most of these effects weren't happening while I was recording footage, so I have no idea what that was about. Maybe it has to do with how I got past the copy protection, maybe it has to do with Dosbox, maybe the EGA VGA mode just has more bugs than the Tanny mode. I don't know, for whatever reason, they just weren't working properly. The water and fire crosses are very fun to come across, as the water cross will flood the level and instantly kill all the enemies, while the fire cross will let you shoot a limited number of fireballs instead of bubbles for the duration of the level, which pass straight through everything and kill on contact. The arcade version and most other ports also have a lightning cross that shoots lightning down to kill all the enemies, but I don't think I've ever seen a lightning cross in the DOS version of this game. In fact, two power-ups that definitely didn't make the cut were the alarm bell and crystal ball. Basically, in the arcade version, when you have the alarm bell, the screen flashes to indicate that a powerful item is going to appear, whereas the crystal ball made all the items appear faster so that you could grab them sooner. Naturally, because of the way the power-ups work in the DOS version, these ones are kinda pointless, and thus they don't show up. The one power-up I tend to go nuts over are the potions. When you grab a potion power-up, all of the enemies disappear and the level is loaded up with score items everywhere. The idea is simply to grab all of them before time runs out. If you manage to do this, you get 100,000 points. And I believe in a two-player game, the player who gets the most gets the 100,000 points, or if both players tie, they both get 100,000 points. The umbrellas are also pretty fun, because they let you skip ahead several levels. Of course, they're also really hard to come across. Though if you want to talk super rare, try the fireball bubbles. No, I'm not talking about the bubbles that drop fire when you pop them, I'm talking about the bubbles that, when popped, give you a ton of points and 5 levels worth of fire breathing powers. In the arcade version, with default game settings, these bubbles had a 1 in 4,096 chance of appearing every time a bubble would come out of one of the holes in the floor or ceiling. These bubbles, much to my surprise, did actually make the cut and do indeed show up in this DOS port, but they're very subtle and look like typical green or blue bubbles, but with a yellow outline. If you ever see one of these, go for it, because you probably won't see another one until after many more hours of gameplay. The necklace is an interesting one, since in the original arcade version there were two different kinds, one that makes a bunch of letter bubbles appear, and one that causes a special death orb to start bouncing around the stage and kill enemies on contact. In this DOS version, both necklaces look identical, and the one that's supposed to make the letter bubbles appear, I have no idea if it's actually working properly or not, since the methodology of how the letter bubbles appear was drastically altered for the DOS version. Actually, let's talk about the letter bubbles. Whenever you defeat 3 or more enemies simultaneously, since popping one bubble pops all connected bubbles, a counter adds up to indicate how many more letter bubbles can appear. This counter doesn't tick back down though until you actually pop one of them, and unlike the arcade version, which tends to show letter bubbles instantly, the DOS version randomly decides when to make them appear, if they can. The letters themselves spell the word extend, a play on the idea of extending your quarter's worth of gameplay, because if you spell the entire word, the level you're on instantly ends and you get an extra life. You also get extra lives at 50,000 and 300,000 points, though I'm not sure if there's more score-based lives beyond those two. The information about this DOS version is really hard to come by, so I've been having to figure a lot of this out myself. And one thing I can say for certain is that power-ups don't appear in this version like they do in the arcade version. At first glance, even when playing the arcade version, you may assume that the power-ups are random. In fact, they are not random at all. Instead, they're based on a huge number of counters that are being tracked. Things like how many bubbles you've blown, how many times you've died, how many of a specific kind of item has been picked up, the list just goes on. The counters used in the DOS version are very different from the ones used in the arcade version, and considering all the bugs in this version of the game, I wouldn't be surprised if there's still power-ups hidden away in this game that I've never seen simply because the counters are bugged out and don't work properly. In fact, that could easily explain why I've never seen a lightning cross in this version. Another big change too is the way you earn points from defeating multiple enemies at a time. In the arcade version, when you kill 2 or more enemies simultaneously, you get an exponentially large amount of points depending on how many enemies you got at once. Here in the DOS version, those bonuses don't exist, but instead, the food items the enemies turn into are themselves worth exponential amounts of points, starting at 500 and going up to 16,000. Also, the double-digit trick for the arcade version doesn't work here. You see, normally if the 10s and 100s digits match in your score, the bubbles will turn into food items at the end of the level. Or if 2 players are playing, you have to match the digits between the 2 scores. Those tricks though, they just don't work in this DOS port. There's also a series of secret rooms you can come across, but getting to just the first one of these is a trip and a half. The secret rooms are accessible from levels 20, 30, and 40. To find one, you have to get to one of these levels without dying once, then jump into the door that appears. This is a heck of a lot more difficult than it sounds, and as far as the DOS version is concerned, I've only ever been to the secret room from level 20 a handful of times, and I've only ever seen the level 30 secret room once. And I've never gotten to level 40 without dying, and heck, if you manage to make it as far as level 50 with all of your lives intact, there's a door that should appear that acts as a shortcut to level 70. And it's hard for me to fathom even getting that far without dying though. This game may look all innocent and cute, but trust me, it's hard as freaking nails. Actually, despite the bugs and changes from the arcade version, I only have one real disappointment regarding this DOS port: the way the game ends. Bobble's ending is infamous because in most versions of this game, if you beat it with just one player, you get a bad ending that's short and unsatisfying with eerie music to make you feel just that much more uncomfortable. Whereas if you beat the game with 2 players, you get a good ending that actually feels like an ending and has more uplifting music. Though from what I understand, even that wasn't technically the true ending, since you had to use a code to put in on the arcade machine to get into a special mode to get the best ending possible. The DOS port, however, well, let's just put it this way. Since I only ever beat the DOS version maybe once in my entire life before now, I'd only ever seen what I thought was the bad ending. Keeping in mind, I have several other ports of this game, most of which I play far more often than the DOS version. So when I was playing through this week and encountered that ending again, I decided to switch the game into 2-player mode, played with just a single character all the way up to the end, then had the other character join back in during the final boss fight. The thing is though, the final boss is supposed to shoot all these kinds of projectiles at you, but again, wasn't for some odd reason. And then when I defeated it, yeah, plain old bad ending again, despite having both players going. You know, I really should load this up on my Tandy system sometime again and try to figure out just what the heck is going on, because I find it hard to believe that the final boss and ending didn't translate over properly. In fact, I'm almost certain the final boss in the DOS version was supposed to shoot stuff at you. Like, is Dosbox the problem? Was getting around the copy protection the problem? Or am I just remembering the game wrong or something? I don't know, it's just really weird. But you know what? Despite these issues, I still had fun playing through the DOS version again, even though I much prefer the other versions I have. And of course I have a number of tips to help you all out, most of which will probably work in other versions of the game. Though there is one tip I have that's more DOS specific than any of the other ones, and that's to take advantage of bumping your head. You see, the DOS version is programmed in such a way that if any part of your body becomes obscured by solid blocks, you can freely move left and right despite any walls that might be in your way. In most versions of the game, walls are a bit more solid and the physics work quite a bit differently if you try to jump through them. Still, by taking advantage of this idiosyncrasy, certain levels in the DOS version will be much easier than their arcade counterparts, though a few may actually be even more difficult as a result of this. For example, it'll be almost impossible to land inside an empty 2x2 square. Another trick to take advantage of is kissing enemies, quote unquote. Now, this is a nickname for the technique of blowing a bubble around an enemy at point-blank range so that it will pop against you instantly. And this is a tricky enough technique to do in the arcade version, and in the DOS version it's next to impossible due to the pixel-accurate hit detection going on. However, this pixel accuracy does lend itself to a different kind of kissing technique that allows you to trap enemies in bubbles simply by being close enough and trying to blow a bubble in a spot that would normally instantly pop it. But because the hit detection routines check the enemy first before the bubble, the enemy gets trapped inside instead. Now, despite there being 100 levels, it's actually pretty easy to memorize where all the power-ups appear, and once you know where they appear, you can make sure you do everything in your power to be ready to collect them. Or if they're too hard to collect, just go for the enemies instead. When you are going for the enemies though, try not to leave just one left roaming around at any point in time because it'll get angry and move a lot faster. Instead, get yourself down to 2 enemies, then trap both of them before getting rid of them. The DOS version has a couple other interesting trade-offs. For starters, none of the levels have more than 6 enemies, whereas in most ports of the game, levels can have up to 7 enemies. In contrast to this though, enemies that shoot have much faster shots and no indication at all that they're going to shoot in the first place. So try not to ever stay perfectly level with a shooting enemy, and be ready to jump the instant you see them shoot anything at you, because you'll have very little time to dodge the attack. My final piece of advice is to try not to go crazy over the power-ups. Yeah, some of them are pretty fun, but chasing down a power-up often leaves you vulnerable to attack and cuts into your time limit. Generally, you don't want to go out of your way to get a power-up no matter how good it is. Either go for it because you can, or because it's en route. If you go for it because you simply want it really badly, you're probably gonna die. And yeah, that's the DOS version of Bobble. As far as ports go, it's not a very good one, but it's still a very playable game despite that, and for years this was my only way of playing the game on a regular basis, at least until I started getting more versions, like the Game Boy version, the Saturn version, the Wii version, and I have plans to get a couple more that I keep neglecting to pick up, like the NES and Sega Master System versions, the SMS port being considered one of the best of them that's not arcade perfect. Heck, this could be one of the most ported games in existence, and chances are pretty good that if you have an old 80s system that had at least a few dozen games on it, Bobble was probably ported to it. I just kinda wish modern remakes were more kind to this game. The true sequels to Bobble are known as Bubble Symphony and Bubble Memories, the former only showing up in the Windows and Xbox versions of the Taito Legends 2 collection, and the latter being virtually impossible to find. And while there is a Korean Bubble collection that has all three of these games in them, they never really got the attention that they deserved. And despite all the remakes and ports, there's never been a true Bobble 4, let alone proper ports of the sequels. My hope is that someday down the road, Square Enix, who currently operates Taito as a subsidiary company, will make some proper ports of these sequels, and perhaps, if we're really lucky, we'll see a true Bobble 4. I'm not holding my breath though. As popular as the series was in the 80s, it's mostly forgotten about nowadays, and really, that's just sad. Not helped by the portable remakes that have popped up. A Bobble Revolution for the DS has somewhat creepy artwork and a major bug in the North American release that prevents players from getting any further than level 30. Bobble Evolution for the PSP, it's overly complicated and totally misses the appeal of the original games. Lastly, Bubble Double Shot for the DS does have some uniqueness and charm to it, but again, it's just making the original formula more complicated for no good reason. Square Enix, if you guys are listening, my recommendation if you really want to get people into Bubble again, do proper ports of the real sequels. I guarantee you that's all it would take. Anyways, if you happen to have the DOS version and want to get it running in Dosbox, just keep in mind that you have to set a fixed cycles count because there's a very strange bug with the game that causes it to slow down to a snail's pace if you run it on too fast a system. Yes, the game gets slower the faster your system is. You can try figuring that one out. In any case, a cycles count to 4,000 seems to be what works the best. You can also reconfigure the options by starting the game with the /R command line parameter, which you'll have to do every time you want to switch between using one or two players. Lastly, the DOS version does indeed have disk-based copy protection, and as usual, to get it going in Dosbox, you're gonna have to find a way around it. And that's all for the 100th episode of Ancient DOS Games. Many thanks to all of you for continuing to watch the show, sending in your guesses, your comments, your requests, and everything else that helps to make shows stick around. I'll be uploading a new filler on the 22nd, 2 weeks from now, just to let you guys know what's going to happen with the future of Ancient DOS Games, so make sure you stay tuned for that. But for now, I gotta find a way out of my basement, so if you'll excuse me, it's time to figure out what this new key tool of mine can actually do. What haven't I even tried yet? Axis, hammer. Axis, cutter. I don't believe this. Trapped by a stupid bubble. Wait a minute. A bubble. Axis? Thermonuclear bomb.